In this day and age, it's fairly common for two college students to get drunk and then have sex with each other. And in these cases of mutually drunk sex, there seems to be a double standard at play which blames the male students for the encounter, but not the female students. People in general as well as college administrators, argue that he should have known better than to have sex with her. She was too drunk to consent. Even though the female student did the exact same thing. She also chose to have sex with a drunk person and failed to consider that he could not consent because he was also drunk. When a man does it, he's a criminal. But when a woman does it, she's a victim. Heads I win, tails you lose. Now, in practice, when these situations arise, the first person to sue the other person is the one who becomes the victim, and the person being sued becomes the perpetrator simply because the other person, usually the woman, sued first. In fact, the men in these cases could potentially sue the women first and reverse the entire situation, but for whatever reason, that doesn't usually happen, if ever. This appears to be why, in practice, the blame usually falls on the men. They just didn't sue first. That's the explanation for why the male students get blamed in practice, and that has to do with the ridiculous nature of affirmative consent laws and other college policies for addressing sexual misconduct claims. But in this video, I'd like to talk about why some people seem to think that it's right to blame only the male students for these mutually drunk encounters. This, I will argue, is a double standard, and it appears to be held by feminists and non-feminists alike. Now, despite the unilateral and somewhat cliché way that I introduced this topic only moments ago, I actually think that the argument that favors blaming the men in these situations is actually a valid argument. That is, if the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. But I don't think the premises are all true, at least not in these situations. So what I'm going to do for most of this video is explain the argument that would otherwise say, yeah, blame the men, and only at the end of the video will I go back and say, okay, but here's where it goes wrong in these situations. So I am going to give the argument a pretty fair shake. Most of this video may well sound like I'm saying, yeah, blame the men, the women, nothing. But just hold on until the end, and I'm going to explain why it doesn't actually work. In order to explain the argument in favor of blaming the men in these mutually drunk encounters, I'm going to highlight two analogous situations that will help illustrate why this argument is valid. But after that, I'm going to explain why the argument does not apply in cases of mutually drunk sexual encounters, and perhaps more importantly, why people believe that it does. And I'll give you a hint as to that second part. Think doggy style. I know, it makes sense, just bear with me. First analogy is the touching analogy. Imagine that you're just standing around minding your own business, and then I walk up to you and I poke you on the shoulder and I leave my finger there. Now, who is touching who? Well, technically, by virtue of the fact that two people are now in physical contact, you're touching me just as much as I'm touching you. But we understand that there's more to it than that. It matters that I'm the one who is doing the touching, whereas you're simply receiving the touching. It wouldn't really make sense in this situation for me to say, I never agreed to this, while it would make perfect sense for you to say, you never agreed to this. Because even though you're technically touching me as much as I'm touching you, it matters, and we understand that it matters, that I'm the one who is initiating and maintaining the contact. So, as I said, I couldn't exactly say, I never agreed to this, but it would make perfect sense for you to say that. Although I suppose, in a sense, you are maintaining it in the fact that you didn't pull away. You're just like, huh? I don't know. Maybe it's not a perfect analogy. And by the same token, this might be a spoiler alert for what I'm actually getting into later in the video, but who gives a fuck. If a man walks up to a woman and, in this incredibly crude analogy, puts his penis inside her just on the street, then technically, by virtue of the fact that there is now a penis inside a vagina, the woman is having sex with the man just as much as the man is having sex with the woman. But we understand that that's not the end of it. It also matters who is facilitating it and who is simply receiving it, kind of like the touching analogy. Second analogy is the drunk driving analogy. The point I made with the touching analogy also applies in situations where the two people are both drunk. not only does it matter who facilitated the action, but if you were drunk at the time, that's no excuse, as we see with drunk driving. You can't get out of a ticket by saying, "I was too drunk to consent to driving." The fact is that even if you are drunk, you are held to the same standards as a sober person when you are committing some action. You are responsible for your traffic violations when you're drunk, you are responsible for the people you touch when you're drunk, and yes, you are responsible for the people you rape when you're drunk. Those are the two analogies that I wanted to get through. Now, as you can see from these two analogies, the key question that needs to be asked is, who was in the driver's seat? Both literally and figuratively. And that's the question that needs to be asked if you want to assign blame. Who was actually committing the illegal action, understanding that being drunk is not an excuse. With the driving analogy, the question of who was literally in the driver's seat is a very simple binary question. You either were, and you're responsible for the car crashing or whatever, or you're not, in which case you're not responsible for the car crashing. And if you were in the driver's seat, the fact that you're drunk is not an excuse. Whether you agree with that or not, that's just how it is right now. With the touching analogy, there's more potential for confusion about who was in the metaphorical driver's seat, since there isn't just one driver's seat anymore like there is in a car. We could imagine that, for example, as I reach out to poke you in the shoulder, you kind of roll up your sleeve to expose your skin, and you lean toward me as you do it, pretty much doing everything you can to facilitate the touch. In this situation, we're both facilitating the touch to a large degree, and it's that much more difficult for either of us to say that we didn't consent to it. Now, keeping all of that in mind, let's go back to mutually drunk sexual encounters. The debate usually goes like this. Granted, it's not usually put in these terms, but I think these illustrate the thought process in people's minds, and I think this is how it would be put into words. The man and the woman both had sex with a drunk person, so why are you only blaming the man? Oh, come on. I mean, yeah, technically, by virtue of the fact that there was a penis inside a vagina, they're both having sex with each other, but we understand that that's not the end of it. It also matters who was facilitating it, like with the touching analogy and the drunk driving analogy. Just because they were both having sex with each other does not mean that they were equal participants and therefore equally blameworthy. So you're saying that during sex, the men are always and exclusively in the driver's seat doing all the work, while the women just lie there limp doing nothing. Well, I guess so, yeah, probably. And therein lies the false premise that makes this argument not sound in cases of drunk sexual encounters. The premise that is false is that the men are exclusively or even predominantly in the driver's seat during these drunken sexual encounters. Granted, it's not a completely baseless assumption given the biomechanics of human sex, but who knows? Maybe they didn't do it doggy style, there's that hint, but maybe the woman was on top and she was doing all the work while the man just lied there and contributed nothing. Either way, there's usually plenty of give and take between both parties, so it's not very clear who was in the driver's seat in these mutually drunk sexual encounters, and in sober sexual encounters, to be honest. But also consider the fact that these drunk men and women often can't even remember exactly what happened, which makes it even less clear who was in the driver's seat, as it were. The only way you could either blame the man or the woman for the encounter is if you videotaped it and saw that one of them made no move to facilitate the intercourse. This is why the argument for always blaming the men in these mutually drunk encounters fails. Whether or not the men were in the driver's seat is not usually known, nor can the extent to which each person facilitated the intercourse be proven, since there's usually a lot of give and take. Oh yeah, and sometimes they don't even remember what happened, so how can you possibly blame one person more than the other? This is a true double standard. If a man has mutually drunk sex, we assume that he facilitated it and he's a rapist. But if a woman has mutually drunk sex, we assume that she contributed nothing and she's probably a victim. And we, by which I mean colleges and activist groups, but people in general, need to stop addressing sexual assault claims this way. In fact, you could phrase my argument in feminist-friendly terms by saying something like, the idea that the men are at fault in these situations is based on a patriarchal assumption of women as passive and impotent, and men as active and capable, or something like that. and you might just trip up any feminists who would blame the men in these situations. So that's the big idea that I'd like to get out in this video, but I'd like to do just a little bit of after-video commentary on some ideas related to this topic. First is, I want to show you the image that originally motivated me to make this video. This was a 2008 image from Coastal Carolina University, and I'd like to just kind of briefly explain how it came about. So I'll link to a news story in the description that explains this, but basically it arose at that university in 2008. They stopped making it in 2008, and it wasn't very widespread on campus, so, you know, I can forgive them on that front. It's recently gotten dragged up just because discussions have gone this way and people see this image and they rightly say, what the fuck? What's wrong with you? Second thing I'd like to mention is that the YouTuber Laci Green almost addressed this question of mutually drunk sexual encounters. And I say almost because she touched on some key points that I made in this video, but she doesn't quite nail her colors to the mast, as it were. I'll link to her video at the correct time index in the description, but these are some points that she goes through one after the other, not really connecting them. First, she says that it does matter who initiates and facilitates a sexual encounter, but then she also says, well, it's usually kind of back and forth. Most people usually facilitate and initiate. And then she just kind of says, well, you shouldn't have sex with drunk people. Let's walk through this, okay? So, from statements 1 and 2, the logical conclusion is, as I've said, that both parties are to blame, and you can't really charge either of them with rape. But Laci doesn't really connect those dots and go that extra yard. Instead, she prematurely concludes this section of her video by saying, well, you just shouldn't have sex with drunk people. Okay, but it still does happen, Laci, and in cases where it does happen, what do you think about that? What then? You can't just say, oh, well, don't do it. You know, abstinence-only sex education doesn't work, and saying, oh, well, that shouldn't arise anyway. It's like, well, it does. What then?